Okay, so welcome to this short 1-hour webinar about essential HR policies and procedures. I'm going to share my screen. As I said, this will be sent to you with some other handouts and a link to the recording. So hopefully everyone can see that. So this is me. I give most of the one-to-one advice and support to frontline groups in Bournemouth, Christchurch, and Poole. Some of you who are from Dorset, my colleague Avril has only just left. We're in the process of recruiting somebody else to replace her. But although this is a 1-hour webinar, we're going to send you stuff. If you've got any queries or questions after today, you can contact me direct. So best to do it by email or to use the mobile telephone number. No need to take notes, as I said, because the slides will be sent to you in due course. Can I just see? I think all of you are members of CAN. Is anybody not a member of CAN? Not everyone's got their camera on, so I'll take silence as a yes. Yeah, so just so you know, obviously membership is free. You get unlimited access to one-to-one advice and guidance, either from me or from Avril's replacement when they're in post, and access to the membership zone. Now, don't forget the membership zone there. There's quite a lot of material. And to get into that, you need to contact Hello at and ask them just to get the URL to get into the membership zone. So there is quite a lot in there about employment stuff, including templates and guidance and links to other sources of advice and support. So why bother to have HR policies and procedures? Anybody want to give me any sort of answers about why you need to have these?
Protects both yourself and the employees.
Okay, yeah. Anyone else? Any other ideas?
Protect the organisation as well.
Yeah. Anything else?
So everyone knows what the how to conduct themselves and what the processes are within that organization.
Okay, yeah, okay. So internal, basically, so people know how to do it internally. Okay. So what we're going to do this morning in a quick 1 hour, it's obviously only an hour. It's a very sort of quick, broad picture, but I'm going to try and cover about why you need them, some of the sort of policies that you should have anyway, whether you have staff or not, and then those that you have basic HR policies within an employment lifecycle perspective. So in terms of when they start, whilst they're working with you, and when you leave. And just a bit about actually talking about policies for other sorts of people like volunteers, maybe casual staff and contractors. And then actually maybe a couple other policies that you might need to think about because of the activity that you undertake. And then at the end, some useful links. But as I said, the first way is why have HR policies and procedures. One thing is they can make your organization more efficient, rather than suddenly scratching your head and searching on the web or ringing up CAN and saying, oh God, how do we turn with someone going on maternity leave? Or what do we do about a disciplinary? By you having sort of done all this work beforehand, then it will save you time later on. So it's about speeding up decision making and making it more efficient and effective. Because obviously, if you've got a member of staff and has got a query, they want a quick response as well, depending on the query that they've got. A lot of you said about protecting your organization. You know, there are some policies that you need to have in place that legally, and others that will be referred to, particularly when things go wrong. And it's about clarity and consistency for all involved. It's so someone said about that actually everyone does it in the same sort of way, and that everyone understands how things are, how decisions are made and who makes those decisions. And CIPD, which is the sort of professional body for HR professionals, does say that, you know, having a good set of organizational policies and procedures does foster a culture of trust, fairness and inclusion within the organization. So these are all 4 good points about why you need to spend the time and energy creating this sort of suite of policies and procedures, but then obviously going back every now and again and refreshing them and reviewing them. I think there is the danger if your practices differ from your procedures. And sometimes you start to hear that, particularly within organizations, as you know, they have this nice sort of, used to say a file on the shelf, but most often now it's going to be, you know, something in a shared drive or a Google Drive or something of policies and procedures, where you hear within the organization is, well, that's not the way it works here. And that should be a red flag, because there's an organizational risk with it, with that. There's an organizational risk that, you know, as I said, people start to grumble and rumble underneath, and they think they're a special treatment and that people aren't being treated fairly, and therefore those grumbles can start up, and that could build up into, you know, a loss of confidence and trust in you as the employer. And that could even lead to a tribunal, where people are so aggrieved that they then actually maybe might, you know, resign, but then make a claim to a tribunal for constructive dismissal, or even if you've carried through a dismissal, perhaps as part of disciplinary, then they go for unfair dismissal. And very often, one of the crucial things that anything that happens at a tribunal is they'll ask the question, did you as the employer followed your written policy and procedure? And there are many, many cases, those of you who read mine know the stuff, the number of times where I've put a little thing about a tribunal case where someone did something really, really heinously wrong as a worker and got dismissed, but actually they went to the tribunal and said, because the employer didn't follow their written policy and procedure, written disciplinary procedure, that therefore it was an unfair dismissal, and they won. Even though the court might have said, actually, what they did wrong, what they've dismissed with, was probably, you know, a reasonable reason. Just because you didn't follow what your written procedure said, then the employee actually wins their case. So you need to get it right, and you need to follow them once your policies and procedures are in place. I think if you think that, for instance, they're not being followed, then it's probably to ask yourself this question: you know, are the policies too bureaucratic and not fit for purpose? You know, you might have this sort of like 20-page long document that actually nobody really understands, or it's so complicated, or it doesn't really fit your organization. So it's horses for courses. You know, you need to make your policies and procedures succinct and relevant to your organization, but it must cover all the bases, really, so that you don't get into a legal problem later on down the line, particularly leading to something like a tribunal. The other thing to ask yourself is if what's happening on the ground is because one person started doing it, and then, you know, a colleague asked them, well, how do you deal with a leave request? How do we deal with someone going on maternity leave? And they tell them, you know, one-to-one, but actually it's not, it wasn't following the organization's own procedures. So you need to check to see actually whether there is folklore developing within your organization, rather than following your procedures and policies. I guess the other thing is that people could be maverick, that actually you might have these policies and procedures in place, but people decide to do their own thing because maybe they don't agree with it or they think it is too complicated. So it means you might have to put your foot down and to say to everyone, this is the way we do it. If you don't, well, it could lead to a disciplinary action. So I think, if you feel that you've got these policies and procedures, but they aren't being followed, then you need to ask yourself the question, why? And then review how you do things, improve your policy procedure, change them, make sure everyone's aware of how things should be done and the updates that you've made, and then to check, obviously, that people are following it as they go through. So although this is about, HR, employment stuff, there are probably other policies that you as an organization need to think about having in place anyway, even if you don't have any staff. You probably only have volunteers and people making use of your services. But actually, when you get employees coming in, you will probably refer to these sort of overarching policies. So, equality, diversity, inclusion is quite important. Particularly if you're looking for funding now, a lot of funders will ask for an EDI policy. And obviously that will relate to employment as well, because of the Equality Act will protect, employees or prospective employees from discrimination. And therefore you need to have an EDI policy in place before you start employing people, that you don't fall foul of the Equality Act. The other thing, obviously, you're going to be most of you are dealing with people, I think. They come and use your services, and you'll have volunteers. So you as an organization need to be aware and think about your health and safety provision. Now, some of you know that actually, as soon as you get 5 employees, you statutorily have to have a health and safety policy. But I would say all organizations need to think about health and safety. Again, it's proportionate to what you do, how complicated and stuff like that. But you need to probably have thought about health and safety even before you have staff coming in. I've put environmental on, again, probably not, in a way, you've got to think about how your staff are going to implement that. But again, a lot of funders are expecting organizations to have an environment policy of some kind. And obviously, when you have staff coming in, then naturally they might need to be involved in developing that, because in some ways they're going to be the ones that are probably going to generate most of your carbon. Safeguarding. Now, the Charity Commission, I think all of you on this call are registered charities. So the Charity Commission does expect all charities to have what they call a safeguarding policy. Now, that's not safeguarding of children and adults at risk. That's safeguarding anyone who comes into contact with your charity. So the public, users, volunteers, trustees. So that's talking about health and safety. That's talking about data protection. So other aspects that they can be harmed. So all charities ought to have some sort of overarching safeguarding policy. And again, obviously, once your employees come in, that would cover them as well. Similarly, data protection. If you're holding personal data on, for instance, volunteers, maybe some of your users, then you already would probably need to have a data protection policy in place, and then that would cover employees as well. And then obviously, once you have employees, you've not got to make sure your data protection policy does make it clear to employees how they carry out their personal responsibility for protecting personal data. So remember that actually organizations, but also individuals within an organization, can be found guilty of breaches of data protection. So there have been cases of where individuals within an employee within organizations have been personally fined for misuse of personal data. Complaints, again, any organization should have a complaints policy, because you're going to need that if you have volunteers. Volunteers can't use a grievance procedure. They should use a complaints procedure. I'm going to touch on this later on. Charity Commission does expect that most charities to have some sort of complaints procedure anyway for them for users and members of the public. Similarly, whistleblowing. Again, Charity Commission does expect charities to probably have a whistleblowing policy in. So again, so that maybe users, volunteers could actually make a protected disclosure. So in a sense, breaking confidentiality about the organisation where they think it's in the public interest. So you need to think about having a whistleblowing. And again, you know, when your employees come in, they'll have that right to use a whistleblowing procedure. All of these, if you don't already know, you know, you can come to CAN to get templates, advice and support on developing and any of the policies and so on that we're talking about later on around health and safety. Okay, so down to basic HR policies. So as I said, CIPD, you know, do think about the sort of employment cycle at the start, during, and at the end. So I'm going to go through those a bit. So at the start. So there are ones that obviously linked to recruitment. A good practice is to have clear job descriptions in place for each member of staff. And I would say they should be not a list of tasks, but a list of roles and responsibility. You know, tasks should be determined by the manager on like an ongoing basis that fit within within their role and responsibility. Because basically, if you quite often contracts are usually attached to a job description, and therefore you want to change the job description, that usually has to be done by mutual consent. So if you're saying that someone is supposed to, you know, record the names and addresses of users who come through the door, and you put that in their JD, and then you want to take it out, you can only do that with mutual consent. So you want to have something a bit vague, you know, to undertake registrations as required. So it becomes then a managerial decision about what that might be. And then once you've got a JD, a person specification goes quite often against that identifies maybe the skills, experience and expertise that a person needs to have to carry out the roles and responsibilities in the job description. There is an awful lot of literature about what's called blind shortlisting and panel interviews. I guess I would have to say probably in the not-for-profit making sector, we follow very much sort of what happens in the public sector. So we don't tend to use CVs. We tend to use applications, and there is lots of research around to show that blind shortlisting, so the shortlisting panel doesn't get personal information. So they don't get to see the name and address and even maybe some other identifiers. So that's to lessen lessen the chance of unconscious bias, and there's research that shows that. You know, people might know this thing about the I can't remember, was it one of the German orchestras, you know, that basically had very few women players, and so what they started doing was when they had people coming to, you know, play their instrument, they started to do it behind screens, so that actually the choosing panel couldn't see the gender of the person playing, and they found that made a big difference. Although interestingly, then they started to find that some of the interview panel were listening out for what shoes people were wearing. You know, either that women tend to wear high heels, so therefore have more clattery sound. So they then found a way of doing it. So that was just really a proof that people are looking out for indicators that are actually totally irrelevant to the position of the job. So there is this idea about blind shortlisting and panel interviews. So that means you would probably need to have a policy in place about recruitment and selection that would talk about actually how you advertise, what information will be given to people, how the shortlisting will be carried out, whether it's blind or not, how the interview panel will be set up and what it will be used. Quite often, for instance, scoring is used as well. And it's really important to have that all documented, because someone goes to a tribunal, for instance, someone can go to, and it happens fairly regularly, people go to a tribunal who haven't been given a job claiming discrimination, and they have the right to do that. And you then have to, as an employer, you have to disclose all material that you used, including any notes that a shortlisting or interview panel undertook. And it's important that actually all that notes made by shortlisting or interview panels are just matters of fact, not opinion. And again, people have won. In fact, when I was working in London, there were hosts of people who it was known who were going from job interview to job interview, and basically then would go to a tribunal to claim discrimination, and quite often they won. Again, because organisations weren't following their procedures. Again, the other thing to have ready is your written statement of employment particulars. So there's a link here to advice about what that should be. And so statutorily, on day one, you must give a statement of employment particulars that has certain information in it. Now, it's slightly different from a contract of employment. And quite often, a contract of employment will include the statement of employment particulars, but you need to make sure that that's all given on day one. But actually, as I said, there's a link here to shows the difference between what must be in a statement of employment particulars and then what can be additional information in a contract. But you need to have that already, because as I said, you need to have that on day one. So you probably want to send it to someone before they start. And then linked to the employment contract will be stuff around discipline and grievance. And you might have all of that in a employment contract, or you might have that as a separate policy, and it must follow the ACAS code of practice. If it doesn't, then if someone goes to employment tribunal, they will win. So not only will they check that you have followed your own disciplinary procedure or grievance, they will check that actually meets the minimum in the ACAS code. These are links, so when you get the slides, you'll get these hyperlinks. The other thing that employees should have is a privacy notice. So they will be covered by data protection. So you will need to let them know what personal data you're holding on them and why, the legal reasons. Some of it will be legal. For instance, you need to provide information to HMRC, and that is a legal requirement of an employer. And so there's that your basis will be legal. Others will be perhaps will be legitimate because it's for you to undertake good line management of them, but you need to provide them with an employee privacy notice. And then stuff about various types of leave. I'll talk about this a bit more in the future, but there is a useful list on the government website of the different types of leave that people are that are mandatory, that by law that they are entitled to. So during employment, policies linked to statutory rights. So you need to have an outline of annual leave entitlement. Now, again, this might be in your contract, or you might want to have a separate policy that might talk about things that, for instance, that people, so statutory right is that people can give you notice of the same period of the amount of leave. So if they want a week's leave, they can give you a week's notice, unless you write it into a contract or into a policy to do so. So for instance, it is totally up to you to say when staff take leave, as long as you make it clear to them up front. So obviously people in schools, for instance, can't take their leave when they want to. They have to do it during the school holidays. So that's written into their contract, and that's written into their policies and procedures. You might have something similar because of the way that you operate, but you should have something very clear for people about how their leave, what leave they're getting, and how it's calculated. Number of hours that they work, and again, you know, whether that is flexible or whether it's set periods of time, or even set periods of the year, for instance. You know, you can annualize leave. So rather than most people get something like, you know, 15 hours a week, but you might annualize it and then actually perhaps concentrate all that work maybe in the summer, because that's when most of your activity is. Totally up to you, but again, you need to detail that in some sort of policy and procedure. Sick leave and pay arrangements. Again, I guess quite a lot of you might just only provide statutory sick pay. So all we all need to do is, you know, refer that we only pay statutory sick pay, but you probably need to have something very clearly either in the contract or in a policy and procedure about actually how staff notify you, keep you in touch, update you with how things are going, and the provision of fit notes. Probably stuff around parental leave and pay, emergency time off for dependents, and the right to request flexible working, which is about to change. So at the moment, you know, it's only people that have worked for you for at least 6 months. It is probably going to become a day one right. We'll wait to see. There is a bill slowly going through Parliament. It's not law yet, but it's likely to become law. We will flag this up in Know Your Stuff when it does become law. Now, this is different from hybrid working. So flexible working is a statutory right. So this is where an employee can actually ask flexible working, and the employer has to give due consideration to it, and then can only refuse it on particular grounds. To be honest, they're pretty broad, but they actually have to be very clear why they're refusing it, and that's it. Whereas hybrid working is something which has come out probably post-COVID, where actually you mutually agree with an employee, but actually retain the right as the employer to change it. That makes sense. But that's about something else. So talk about hybrid working is different from flexible working, as I said, because flexible working is a statutory right. So ending employment. So you need to be clear about the notice required on termination of contract. Okay, so both sides. And again, you might want to increase or change the notice period from you as the employer. You know, how much notice an employee has to give you. An employee has a statutory right to termination on the number of years service. So after 2 years, they're entitled to 2 weeks notice, and then it builds up for each complete year. So 1 week for each year, up to a maximum of 12 weeks. And you can't change that. That's a statutory right. But you as the employer can determine whether they give you, you know, a week's notice, a month, 2 months, 3 months. But again, you need to be clear about that. Yeah, resignation notice period. Redundancy, again, obviously you hope that doesn't happen, but it is a form of dismissal, and you have to follow an absolute process. And there's a guide on the government website to actually the way you must do that, and you must follow it to the letter. Again, people have gone to tribunals for unfair dismissal because an employer hasn't followed correct redundancy procedures, and they've won. And if you do a dismissal, because of a disciplinary, again, you must follow the ACAS code of practice. And again, as I said, there have been plenty of tribunals where people have gone for unfair dismissal and they have won. The other possible policies to have in place, it might be a good idea to have, managing sickness absence, particularly long and short-term sickness, that might talk about how often you and the employer stay in touch. Sometimes people think employers shouldn't hassle people when they're off sick, but actually it's seen as good HR practice for you to stay in contact with people who have been off, just to find out how they are and how things are going. Don't put pressure on them to come back to work before they're well, but actually it's about, looking after their health and welfare, and whether there's anything you can do. It might be an opportunity to talk about, planned return to work on reduced hours, or looking at roles and tasks, for instance, changing things around. And then more details about paid and unpaid leave. Most of the statutory rights to leave are unpaid, but you as an employee might want to add some paid leave into that. It's discretionary. Looking at compassionate leave, there is this statutory right to take unpaid leave for family emergencies, for those who are close members of your family, but you might want to expand that into compassionate leave. Stuff around performance management. So, you might have seen this thing, onboarding is now the current parlance rather than necessarily induction, but it's being seen that's really important. You need to spend some time and energy when someone starts on getting them into the organization, understanding how it works, the culture of the organization, and that needs time and energy. You might want to plan that. So having a policy, again, that means that you've got like a list. You don't have to think through each time. You have a member of staff, you've got something to follow. But again, if you're a larger organization, that there's some consistency about actually how people are brought on board. Probationary review. Most contracts have a probationary period, which clearly states in the contract that during that period, basically, you can terminate employment very quickly on either side, maybe by a week. But you need to follow it through. So you need to have a very clear policy about actually how often those meetings happen, how they're recorded. And to be honest, if you've got a 6 month probationary period and you say at the end of the 6 months to someone, sorry, you're not cutting the mustard, we're not going to do that. Actually, that could be grounds. Someone could go to a tribunal. They should know well before that they're actually not performing as expected, and they're warned about it, and perhaps given some clear tasks or clear targets to meet to improve that performance. So when you get to the end of the 6 months, then you just basically say it's terminate. But also that termination must be done before the 6 months. If you then do it after the 6 months, then actually you've probably contravened your contract with them. So make sure you keep within the timeline. The other thing is capability. So, this is where people are not performing as expected, but they're not doing stuff that you would take them to task on a disciplinary policy. So you might want to have something else like a capability policy. When you look at them, they look very similar to a disciplinary, i.e. that basically you have a meeting with them, you point out actually, we send you documents to get edited. It takes 4 weeks, but they need to be done a lot sooner. We expect it to be done a week. Therefore, over the next 2 months, we want to see that turnaround improve. Do you need any more technical or skills input to make that happen? So you offer support and advice, but you set sort of clear targets, and then when you get to the end of the capability, you say basically, you're not up to the job, therefore we're going to dismiss you. but that needs to be documented in some sort of policy again, so that people don't have the opportunity of going to a tribunal to say this is an unfair dismissal. I did say I'd just sort of like talk about some other things in your organization. You know, I guess nearly all of you are going to have volunteers. You really should have policies and procedures that are targeted just at volunteers. And the most important one is not to have a grievance or disciplinary procedure, but you would have, you know, when things don't go wrong or something like that, that would do exactly the same, so that volunteers are don't seem to be treated as employees. And again, this has happened, you know, volunteers have successfully gone to a tribunal to say that they were dismissed and actually they were being treated as an employee, and they've won. So they've got some sort of compensation claim from the tribunal. Anything about volunteers, then you need to contact, if you're in BCP, then you should contact our volunteer hub within CAN. If you're in Dorset, then talk to the Volunteer Centre Dorset about you know, policies and procedures to have in place for volunteers. As I said, employees, most of your types of users or people in your organization will need a privacy notice. So I've said about employees, we require an employee privacy notice. Your trustees should have a privacy notice. Your volunteers should have a privacy notice. Perhaps your users, if you have people that you're keeping data on, they should have a privacy notice. That's so it's very clear to them what data you're holding, how you're holding it, why you're holding it, and actually what rights they have over that data. Again, we have templates for this. The other people you might have are self-employed or external contractual workers. Now, most policies won't apply to them. That's obviously the benefit of using them, but you must make sure that they are self-employed or contractual workers. Quite a lot of the time, people claim that people are self-employed, really to get away from the roles and responsibilities of being an employer. In fact, actually they aren't. So you need to be very careful that when you take on someone as self-employed or as a contractor, that they actually meet the legal and HMRC definitions of a self-employed person. I said there's some activity-based policies. So I did talk about, you know, hybrid working. Quite often hybrid working does involve, you know, perhaps people spending time working from home rather than working from the organizational office. So it might be good to have a home working policy that covers things like health and safety, confidentiality, data protection, and so on in a work environment, in a home environment rather than in an office environment. And then I said earlier, although the Charity Commission expects all charities to have something about safeguarding, in fact, we call our policy keeping everyone safe. That's what we call it, rather than safeguarding. But actually, if you are working with adults at risk or children, then you'll probably need to look at specific safeguarding policies for them. If you're a value-based organisation, which nearly all of us are in the voluntary and community sector, you might want to have a code of conduct that basically enshrines whatever those values might be, so that your staff, but also I guess your volunteers and even your trustees are very clear about how you expect people to behave according to the values of your organisation. And quite often there's a thing about, you know, living your values. So for instance, if you're a care-based charity, then think about what policies you should have in place for your employees. You know, you might want to have a very good carers leave policy, or else it looks really weird if you're advocating for better carers, carers' rights and support, for you not to do that for your own employees. Other links, obviously, you know, this was only a quick 45 minutes, and then we're gonna have a chance for some questions in a minute. But as I said, I've already pointed out, you can come to CAN for initial advice and support. We've got stuff on the members zone of our website relates to employment. And we put on obviously a number of webinars. So if you're not aware of them, for instance, Sonia Wilson, who runs Populo HR, you know, has this sort of monthly surgery that members can join. She does a short presentation about perhaps something that's quite relevant, and then there's an opportunity for questions and answers. They're absolutely free. So they happen towards the end of each month. It's on our website if you want to sign up for it. So, you know, use CAN as much as possible. External links. The Gov website has quite a lot of information for employers and employees, but that's a good starting point. ACAS has loads of stuff on it, but also they have a helpline that you can ring as an employer and have a conversation with them. And they'll tell you, you know, the sort of statutory responsibilities that you should have and what you should do. So it's sort of, it will give you good signposts about what you should be thinking of. But you might have to think about, you know, if it gets very complicated or very specific, you might need to obviously talk to an HR professional. Do that rather than a lawyer. HR professionals are cheaper than lawyers. They will do most stuff, but if they say it's getting to the legal point, then they'll tell you that you'll have to go and talk to a legal professional. I've talked about CIPD. There's quite a lot of stuff on their website that is really useful, not only in terms of legal minimums, but also good practice. So, for instance, they've got a huge quantity of stuff now about hybrid working and good practice about hybrid working. And then peoplemanaging.com, they have this sort of quite useful link about what are HR policies. Okay. God, that was a quick 45 minutes, chunter through. So time for any questions that you might have.
Hi, Steve.
Yeah.
So we've got a couple of people that we've taken on recently who said that, you know, that they're sort of coming on to help, providing a service for us and almost like an external contractor, because they don't want to go through payroll and that. But so how do I, you know, what is my responsibility?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so yeah, just because someone says that they want to be off the books doesn't obviate you from responsibility. So, you know, HMRC, and I have to say this happened to me many years ago. You know, they come and tap on the door and they say, right, we want to actually look through your books and check your employees and what documentation you have in place. So it was something before I took up as a job. It was where, you know, we had a part-time cleaner, and this person was being paid cash in hand. They didn't give us a P45 or a P46. They're being given cash in hand, and the HMRC inspector quite rightly said, well, actually, you know, you should have been putting them through PAYE. You should have been doing removing tax and national insurance. This had happened over 2 years. We're assuming you paid them net, and therefore we want 1,500 quid from you. Sure. In terms of tax and national insurance. Actually, for us, luckily, this person was heavily involved with the charity themselves, and basically we negotiated down to 400 quid. So you need to check that they actually do fit the definition of being a self-employed employee. HMRC do have an online checker questionnaire because it's complicated. it's not easy to say, and at the end of the day a court will decide. You know, you've seen all those cases about in the gig economy of people that are going to court saying actually we are not employees, we are actually workers because of A, B and C. So the HMRC checker basically asks you a series of questions and then gives you a view about actually whether someone is self-employed or not. The complication is that people can be self-employed and they can be a worker, even with the same organization. It depends on the role they have, the risk they have, how they're paid, whether you're providing equipment and staff. There's a basket of questions that a court takes into account. So you must undertake a check. So if someone asks you, pay me direct, you need to double check. To be honest, if they're a company, if they are a company that invoices, then you're probably all right. But if they're like a sole trader and invoices you, that's a bit more debatable. If they just want cash in hand, that's an absolute no-no.
Okay.
Anybody else got any questions? Oh, no questions. Okay. Let me unshare. So what I would like you to do is do a quick evaluation for us. In the chat, I've put a link to a quick online form. If you could do that. But whilst I'm quite happy to answer any other questions if people have done that and want to ask me anything else.
I was only just going to say, Steve, the sessions at the end of the month with Sonia, I'd done the last one and that was really useful. It was really helpful just to actually sort of be able to take and say, okay, so a bit like Natasha.
Yeah, the individual case. Yeah.
Yeah, to be able to say what's your thinking on this, and then actually within the forum that was there, we actually shared ideas and sort of bounce things off.
Yep.
So it was really, really good. Yeah.
Yeah, the
really
feedback from there has been really constantly good from people. So I would recommend people, you know, she is a specialist. Her company only supports people in the not-for-profit making sector. She's an HR professional. She's actually our on-call professional at CAN, you know, so that actually if we need professional HR advice and support, obviously charges us. But actually she does that, and I know she does that for a fair number of organizations locally. The other thing is that, you know, did talk about the recruitment process. We are doing another webinar, 1 hour webinar on, he says, on the 11th of July, 10 to 11. That's bookable now up on the website. So that'll be a bit more detail about recruitment and selection and good practice and legal stuff. Okay, so any more questions?
That's it. Thank you very much. Very informative.
Okay, yeah, all right. Okay, well, thank you. Hope that's been a bit useful. I know it's a quick chunter through, but hopefully it might get you to think about the right questions to ask. And as I said, you know, either look online at staff or contact us or look in the member zone of the CAN website. But thanks very much for coming this morning, and I hope it's useful.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. See you
Bye.
soon.
Bye.
Thank you.